In 1991, a man named Brian Kendall and his young family decided they had finally had enough of the busy, stressful city life. Brian was a highly skilled carpenter by trade, and he spent his days working in the bustling city of Baltimore, Maryland. It was a good job and it paid the bills, but the environment was not what he and his wife, Belinda, wanted for their young children. Both Brian and Belinda had actually grown up in the quiet, expansive country of West Virginia. They remembered their childhoods fondly, running through open fields and playing in the woods without a single care in the world. They wanted that exact same safe, peaceful upbringing for their own kids. The only major problem with this plan was that if they moved back to West Virginia, Brian would face a brutal, multi-hour commute every single day just to get back to Baltimore for work. It was going to be exhausting, and it would drain him, but after discussing it at length, they decided that the sacrifice was absolutely worth it. So, Brian and Belinda started looking for properties in West Virginia. After searching for a while, they found a beautiful, rustic home in a tiny town called Slainesville. When I say tiny, I mean it. Slainesville had a population of only about 182 people. The house they chose had more of a classic cabin feel to it. It was a ranch-style home, meaning it was a single floor, and it was located way out in the middle of a massive, dense forest. There were no neighbors anywhere in sight. In fact, everywhere you looked from the property, you saw nothing but towering trees and thick undergrowth. It was pure, uninterrupted forest. This cabin was incredibly isolated, but for Brian and Belinda, that was actually a selling point. In their old Baltimore neighborhood, they had lived in a constant state of anxiety. The area was not safe at all, and they never felt comfortable sending their kids outside to play without constant, direct adult supervision. Now, living out in the middle of nowhere, they felt like they could finally relax. They could let their kids step out into the yard and just be kids, without worrying about the dangers of the city. It might have been lonely, but to them, it felt like the safest place on earth. To make things even better and to add an extra layer of security, Brian went out and got a gorgeous, friendly black Labrador retriever. They named her Coco, and she was an instant hit. Right from the very first day, Coco was incredibly protective of the kids. She blended in with the family perfectly, and very quickly, the Kendalls began to absolutely love their new life in Slainesville. Everything seemed to be going incredibly well. Shortly after they had fully moved into the cabin and finally finished unpacking all of their belongings, Belinda wanted to celebrate. She decided to invite her brother, along with his wife and their young daughter, Jordan, to come over and check out the new place. To make the visit extra special, Belinda had bought a cake and some colorful balloons. She planned on throwing a little impromptu surprise birthday party for young Jordan, who was about the same age as her own kids and had recently had a birthday. They figured it would be a wonderful way to welcome their relatives, give the kids a fun treat, and celebrate their beautiful new home. After they ate the cake and sang, the kids took all of the balloons and went into the living room to play together. The living room was located right next to the kitchen, separated only by a wide entryway. The adults stayed in the kitchen, sitting around the table, sipping coffee, and chatting about how peaceful the new property was. But as they were talking, the conversation slowly died down because they all noticed something very strange happening in the living room. The kids had let go of the balloons, and they had all floated up to the very high ceiling of the living room. But then, as the adults watched, one of the balloons began to drift downward. What made it strange was that it was not just falling slowly like a balloon losing its helium. The string of the balloon was completely tight, pulled straight down, almost as if an invisible hand was holding the end of the string and actively pulling it down toward the floor. The adults stopped talking entirely. They were all staring at this balloon because the way it was moving looked completely unnatural. The balloon stopped right in the middle of the room, hovering a few feet off the ground. It was still quite a distance away from the kids, who were distracted and had not noticed it yet. The parents sat in the kitchen, quietly watching this object, totally unsure of what to make of it. Nobody even said a word. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. Then, the balloon slowly started moving horizontally across the room, gliding directly toward little Jordan. At that moment, Jordan turned around and noticed the balloon for the first time. Instead of being startled, she looked at the empty air right next to the balloon and said, "Thank you," as if she was speaking directly to a person standing right there. But there was absolutely no one there. She reached her little hand out to grab the string, but just as her fingers were about to touch it, the balloon suddenly drifted right back up to the ceiling, moving quickly, exactly as if someone had been holding it and had suddenly let go. Jordan reached for it, watched it float away, and then, without a care in the world, she just turned back around and continued playing with her toys. In the kitchen, the adults were completely startled. You can explain a balloon drifting down because of a draft or a slow leak, but they could not explain the tight string, the horizontal movement, and the sudden rapid ascent right as the child reached for it. It looked exactly like a physical hand had guided the balloon and then let it go. The parents stood up and walked into the living room, whispering to each other, asking if they had all just witnessed the same thing. They grabbed the balloon down from the ceiling and tried to pull it down to replicate the tight string, but they could not make it look the way it had just looked. They felt like they were going crazy. Belinda walked over to Jordan and asked her who she had been talking to just a moment ago. Jordan was very young, only about 2 or 3 years old, so she could not quite articulate complex thoughts. Belinda asked again, asking who she was talking to when the balloon floated down to her. Jordan stopped playing, thought about it for a second, and then pointed her tiny finger into the empty corner of the room where absolutely nobody was standing. She looked at her mother and simply said, "Him." The parents looked at the empty corner, then looked at each other, and then they all broke out into nervous laughter. They told themselves that they were just scaring themselves over nothing. They reasoned that the helium must have been acting weird, there was probably a draft they could not feel, and after all, Jordan was only 3 years old. She probably had an imaginary friend, or she was just playing make-believe. They decided to just drop it and forget about the balloon, and for the rest of the visit they did. But after Jordan and her parents packed up and left, Belinda and Brian looked at each other and admitted that the entire sequence of events had been incredibly weird. A couple of days later, Brian had a rare day off. Because he had been working so much and commuting so far, he had not actually had a chance to explore the vast forest surrounding their new property. So, he asked his daughter Blair, who was about 5 or 6 years old, if she wanted to go on an adventure with him to explore the deep woods behind their house. Blair was super excited. She loved spending time with her dad, so the two of them put on their jackets and walked out into the backyard, stepping past the tree line and into the dense forest. They walked for a while, navigating through the thick brush and enjoying the quiet of nature. But after walking a significant distance from the house, they both stopped dead in their tracks. There, sitting in the middle of the dense forest, was something that made absolutely no sense. It was a vehicle. Specifically, it was a large van that looked like it had been completely consumed by a massive fire at some point in the past. It was totally charred, blackened, and rusted out. It was essentially just a burnt metal frame sitting on the forest floor. What made this so baffling was that there were absolutely no roads, dirt paths, or tire tracks anywhere near it. The trees surrounding the van were dense and mature, meaning there was no physical way a vehicle could have been driven to this spot. It was as if it had simply dropped from the sky. Brian, feeling a strange chill run down his spine, walked up to the back of the burnt van and looked inside the open, rusted frame. What he saw made his stomach drop. Inside the back of the vehicle were dozens of burnt, melted stuffed animals and children's toys scattered across the floor. And lying in the middle of the wreckage was the metal spring frame of a mattress that had been completely warped and blackened by the fire. Brian got an immediate, overwhelming feeling of dread. Something about this scene was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He did not want his young daughter looking at this bizarre, disturbing wreckage, so he quickly turned to her, grabbed her hand, and said that they needed to leave right now. They turned around and hurried back to the house. When they got back, Brian immediately told Belinda what he had found in the deep woods. They spent hours talking about it, trying to figure out how a van could have ended up in a roadless forest, and why on earth it was filled with burnt toys and a mattress. Neither of them could come up with a single logical explanation, and it left a lingering sense of unease in the back of their minds. Over the next couple of months, the reality of their new lifestyle began to take a heavy toll on the family. Brian was trying to commute daily from Slainesville to his carpentry job in Baltimore, but the drive was taking up hours upon hours of his day. He was waking up in the middle of the night, driving for hours, working a full day of hard manual labor, and then driving hours back. He was getting almost no sleep and he was constantly exhausted. It was quickly becoming dangerous and unsustainable. Because they only owned one car, they had to make a difficult decision. They decided that Brian would leave the cabin on Monday morning, drive to Baltimore, and stay with his mother, who still lived in Maryland, for the duration of the work week. Then, on Friday night, he would make the long drive back to Slainesville to spend the weekend with his family. This meant that every single week, from Monday to Friday, Belinda, Blair, and little Sean would be completely alone in their isolated cabin in the woods, with absolutely no vehicle and no way to leave the property in an emergency. To many people, this would sound like a terrifying setup. But Belinda had actually grown up in an incredibly isolated home in the middle of a forest in West Virginia. She was very used to this kind of rural lifestyle, and she did not mind the quiet solitude at all. She felt confident, she had her kids, and they had Coco, their big, protective black lab. So she agreed to the arrangement, and for a while they fell into a comfortable routine. Ever since they had moved into the property, Blair had been begging her mother to let her go camping. The family owned a small RV camper that was parked right outside the house on the edge of the driveway, and Blair thought it would be the ultimate adventure to spend a night out there sleeping in the camper. One week, while Brian was away in Maryland for work, Belinda finally decided to cave. The kids had been cooped up inside the house for days, and she could tell they had a bit of cabin fever. She figured letting Blair sleep in the camper would be a fun, easy way to make her happy and break up the monotony of the week. Belinda walked out to the camper with Blair to set everything up. She was not entirely thrilled about the idea of her young daughter sleeping outside alone, so she set some very strict rules. She told Blair that once she went inside the camper, she had to immediately lock the door, and under no circumstances was she to open it for anyone. To ensure her safety, Belinda decided that Coco, their protective dog, would stay in the camper with Blair for the entire night. Blair was completely fine with these rules. She was just excited to be in the camper. She put on her warmest clothes, grabbed a battery-powered lantern, and brought a stack of her favorite books to read. Belinda tucked her into the bed, gave her a kiss, locked the door from the inside, and walked back to the main house, leaving Blair and Coco alone in the quiet RV. The layout of the camper was very tight. The majority of the floor space was taken up by the pull-out bed that Blair was sleeping on. To her right, as she lay down, was a large window. It was covered by a heavy dark blackout curtain that slid across the entire frame. Blair kept this curtain tightly closed. At the foot of her bed, also to her right, was the main door of the camper. This door had a small window built into it, but unlike the side window, this door window had no blind or curtain to block the view. It was just open glass. Eventually, Blair grew tired of reading. She turned off her lantern, plunging the camper into darkness, and snuggled under her warm blankets with Coco lying right next to her. Before long, she fell fast asleep. At some point in the middle of the night, Blair woke up suddenly. The camper was cold, and she noticed that Coco was acting incredibly strange. The dog was highly tense, sitting upright on the bed and staring intently at the small window on the main door. She was behaving as if she had just seen something moving right outside. Blair sat up in bed, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She reached out to pat Coco, trying to calm the dog down, while she peered through the darkness toward the door window. Outside, the forest was bathed in faint, pale moonlight, providing just enough illumination to see the immediate area around the camper steps. As Blair stared at the glass, she saw a dark, solid figure walk slowly past the door. Because of the shadows in the glass, she could not tell if it was a person, a large animal, or something else entirely, but there was no doubt about it. Something had just walked right past her door. Coco immediately began to growl, a low, menacing rumble from deep in her chest. But instead of keeping her eyes locked on the door, Coco's head slowly turned, following the movement of whatever was outside. The dog's eyes locked onto the large side window right next to Blair's bed, the one covered by the blackout curtain. Blair, trying to keep her fear at bay, convinced herself that it must be her mother. She figured Belinda had gotten worried and had come outside to check on her. Blair wanted to quiet Coco down so her mother wouldn't think anything was wrong. She turned her lantern back on, slid out of bed, and walked over to the door. She unlocked it, opened it slightly, and poked her head out into the cold night air. She looked around, expecting to see her mom standing on the gravel. But there was nobody there. The driveway was completely empty. She looked up at the main house, which was just a short distance away, but all the lights were completely off. There was no sign that her mother had ever left the house. Blair called out, "Mom," into the dark forest, but the only response was the rustling of the wind through the trees. Suddenly feeling incredibly vulnerable and frightened, Blair pulled her head back inside, slammed the door shut, locked it tight, and scrambled back onto her bed. The entire time Blair had been at the door, Coco had not moved from the bed. The dog was still sitting in the exact same spot, but now she was staring directly at the blackout curtain over the side window. Coco was baring her teeth, showing her sharp white fangs, and growling fiercely at whatever was standing right on the other side of that thin fabric. Blair was now completely terrified. She jumped into the bed, pulled the heavy covers completely over her head, and curled into a tight ball. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping and praying that Coco would stop growling, that whatever was outside would just go away, and that she could fall back asleep. But Coco would not stop. The dog's growls grew louder and more aggressive. Blair reached out from under the blankets, trying to pull Coco down to hide under the covers with her, but the dog remained rigid, refusing to back down. Blair realized she could not just lie there in the dark, not knowing what was happening. She thought to herself that maybe it really was her mother, and maybe she had just missed her earlier. Maybe her mother was trying to knock on the window to get her attention, and she had not heard it over Coco's growling. She had to look. Blair pulled the covers off her face and crawled slowly toward the side of the bed, pressing her body against the wall directly beneath the window. She reached up with a trembling hand and slowly pulled the edge of the heavy blackout curtain aside. The moment she peered through the glass, her heart stopped. Standing right outside the window, just inches away from her face on the other side of the glass, was a towering, dark figure of a man. He was standing completely still, looking directly down into the camper, staring straight at her. Blair let out a silent gasp, dropped the curtain, and threw herself backward onto the bed, pulling the covers over her head. Coco immediately scrambled over her, positioning her heavy,